Okay, so welcome everyone who's coming in. We'll get started in just a minute. Just want to let you know that this session will be recorded. The video will be recorded. So if you do not want to be on the video, you can turn your camera off, and then the audio will also be posted as part of the podcast. So again, if you don't want audio, you can put your chat in the questions. So if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat and let you know where you're zooming in from, that would be great. All right, and maybe while we're waiting, our panelists can say where they are zooming in from. I am in Long Beach, California, just south of LA.
I'm in New York City, Ellen Cassedy.
And I live in LA, but I'm in Vienna on vacation at the minute.
Wow.
And I'm in Washington, D.C.
West Palm Beach, Florida.
Okay, so to everyone coming in, we'll wait maybe one more minute to begin. Yeah, it looks like we have about 20 people signed in, and I think there were close to 40 who had registered, so we'll give them another minute. As I mentioned, this will be video recorded for the AJL Presents, so if you do not want to be on camera, make sure to close your camera. And the audio will also be rebroadcast, so if you do not want your voice being broadcast, you can type your questions into the chat, and Constanza will be collating them for the end when we get to the question period. All right, well, I have about 3 minutes after. Should we go ahead and start? 1 second. Allergies are acting up. Okay. So go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our gathering today. This panel discussion is part of both the AJL Presents series and the Nice Jewish Books podcast. The video will be archived with the other AJL Presents programs, and the audio will be posted as an episode of Nice Jewish Books, a podcast about Jewish literature for adults. This is another project of AJL, of which I am the host. I want to thank Constanza Kunst, who will be monitoring the chat for technical issues and for questions. And I will begin by introducing our 3 amazing panelists. Yirmiyahu Ahron Taub is a poet, writer, and Yiddish literary translator. He's the author of 2 books of fiction, Beloved Comrades, a novel and stories, and Prodigal Children in the House of God stories, and 6 volumes of poetry, including A Mouse Among Tottering Skyscrapers, selected Yiddish poems. Yirmiyahu's most recent translation from Yiddish is Dina, an autobiographical novel by Ida Mays. Please visit his website at yataub.net.wordpress.com. Mindy Liberman is the translator of Falik and His House, a novella by Jacob Dinizen, published by Jewish Storyteller Press. She has translated articles and other material relating to Dinizen, as well as poems by Miriam Ulanover. Her translation of Dinizen's story, A Foolish Child, is scheduled to appear in the next issue of In Geweib. Mindy grew up in Montreal and was a librarian at the Glendale Public Library, California, for many years. And Ellen Cassedy is the translator from Yiddish of On the Landing, Stories by Ayenta Mash, which she worked on in the Yiddish Book Center's Translation Fellowship Program, and the co-translator with Yirmiyahu Ahron Taub of Oedipus in Brooklyn and Other Stories by Bluma Lempel. She is the author of We Are Here, Memories of a Lithuanian Holocaust, and Working 9 to 5, a women's movement, a labor union. Sorry, I've even had my coffee. And Working 9 to 5, a women's movement, a labor union, and the iconic movie. Her awards include the Grub Street National Book Prize for Nonfiction and the Leviant Memorial Prize from the Modern Language Association. With Anita Norwich, she is currently translating Rachel Veprinsky's novel, Die Kreisten von die Hand, Clasped Hand, and her website is ellencassedy.com. So thank you all so much for being here. One reason why I was inspired to do this panel is because as a reviewer for AJL and a member of the AJL's Fiction Award, and currently the host of the podcast, I've seen recently a lot of new translations of Yiddish, and it just seems to be on an upsurge. So I really wanted to bring people together to talk about this phenomenon, about Yiddish literature, and what their thoughts are on it. So for many people, Yiddish literature begins and ends with Sholem Aleichem's Tevye the Dairyman stories. So would any of you like to talk about the positives and negatives of that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Sholem Aleichem was an utter genius. And those stories, those Tevye stories, are about the whole span of Eastern European shtetl life to American immigration and assimilation, and they cover the globe. Parents, children, oppression, migration, long marriage, it's all there. And he's a universal writer. So anyone who sees Fiddler on the Roof or reads the Tevye stories has to see that right away and be charmed and educated and thrilled by what he's done. But if you stop with Sholem Aleichem, you're going to miss out on a lot, including the work of women who wrote in Yiddish. And translating that work is my passion. Because over the years, women have been prolific writers of Yiddish literature, yet they've historically received less recognition than male writers. And now that is beginning to change. And I hope we're going to have a chance to talk about that in this hour.
Absolutely. Mindy or Yirmiyahu, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I could jump in. There's also something about Sholem Aleichem's tone, which is uniquely his. He was called the Jewish Mark Twain, which is pointed, I would say gently satirical, kind of incredibly aware, but also kind of loving. There's a beautiful, I mean, his language has an incredible rhythm to it. There are cadences of rabbinic literature within it. Tevye kind of is endlessly quoting religious sources. Sometimes some would say misquoting or creatively quoting. All of those are in play with Shalom Aleichem, and it's up to the reader to kind of figure out which is which. And also the way in which, he's aware of the outside culture, the use of Russian words, words from the dominant culture, figure very prominently. There's always this kind of interplay. He's usually on the side of the, I'm not going to say the ne'er-do-well, but, the people don't have as much money. And, that's a big part of his, I think, his appeal. The comedy is always there, laced with, that sort of makes the tragedy kind of bearable. Yeah, all those things come into play. It helped that it was made into one of the most successful Broadway musicals of all time, that is performed around the world. Ellen touched on the universality. There have been productions of Fiddler in Japan, just the most far-flung places in the world. But it's not where it ends. Yeah, it's not where it starts either. And I know we'll talk about that as well. So yeah, I would say Shalom Aleichem is a good place to be. And actually the journey, because now there's like the Yiddish translation of the English adaptation of the Yiddish stories, which themselves were adapted into a Yiddish play. So there are all these layers of cultural mediation, navigation, adaptation, back and forth to different languages. If I'm not mistaken, the Yiddish translation of Fiddler was done in Israel by a translator in Israel. I could be wrong on that, but yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you could have like a whole show, not even just on Shalom Aleichem, but just on Tevye. And I think those themes that, Ellen referred to in terms of universality are definitely in play.
I think I even heard a joke a while ago that in the Star Trek universe that the Klingons were claiming that was originally their story. Okay, Mindy, did you
I would just add that Shalom Aleichem being so well known, and you're the one Yiddish writer that people may know, it's all justified. But if you stop there, as everyone has said, you're missing 100 years of more modern literature that doesn't give you that nostalgic view of the shtetl that you're left with if you're just reading Shalom Aleichem.
Well, that is a great segue into my next question, is what is the timeline of Yiddish literature?
I can start on that one if you want.
Go for it.
All right. Yiddish was spoken by the Jews of Eastern and Central Europe for almost 1,000 years. But I think you'd say that modern Yiddish literature would have started with Mendele Mocher-Svorim, whose first story was published 1864. And then really in the 1880s, there were more writers, a lot of what's called shon trash being written, and Parrott started writing, other Yiddish novelists started writing, and there was a lot of journalism. So I think I would say 1880s till maybe 1980s, although there is still Yiddish being written today. I mean, here we have Yirmiyahu.
Yep, I was just going to say that.
And by before the end of the 19th century, Yiddish was mostly confined to Eastern Europe. But by the end of the 19th century, with the massive emigration that was going on from Eastern Europe, Yiddish was spreading across the globe. And of course, that continued after World War II. And by the end of by the second half of the 20th century, the Yiddish writers who I've worked on translating maybe before the war, they might have gone down to the local cafe to share their work and drink a glass of tea. But in the second half of the 20th century, they were forging connections all over the globe through literary journals, through writing letters internationally, and through cultural centers like the Yiddish Pen Club, which is international, like the Association of Jewish Libraries, and Leivik House in Tel Aviv. So it had become a global phenomenon.
Well, also just to build on what Mindy and Ellen said and to take it back a number of centuries, there are references to, written Yiddish back to the 1200s. And there are a number of really, I guess scholars talk about, Old Yiddish, and then there's the middle period, which is sort of Hasidic and Haskalah literature. Before you start getting into the classic writers, Mendel Sfarim, Shalom Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz. But, there was the Tzena, right, which is the classic compendium of Tanakh. Well, I would say, I think it's Chumash, it's Haftarah, Chamesh Megillas, and possibly other things. Possibly, I believe Midrash also, all sort of creatively woven into this beautiful text, right? That is sort of talked about as being read, largely by women, but is a just foundational compendium of Jewish lore, and that comes out in I believe 1600. There's who else? There's Glickl of Hamel, came out later in the 1600s, who wrote of Hamel in Germany, right? An incredible memoir written by a very shrewd observer of the human condition. She was a businesswoman. She wrote about it's this incredible window into the way Jews lived then. There's the Bava Buch by Elia Bacher, who wrote about, I think it's the story of a beautiful woman a beautiful queen who wreaks revenge on the king. There's the Kibuch, which is the Book of Cows, which is a sort of a compendium of folk tales. And then there's all sorts of stylists in Yiddish too. Shlomo Ettinger, who was, I believe, part of the Haskalah tradition. There's a whole Hasidic tradition of Yiddish, and Reb Nachman of Bratslav, and who is, I forget, related to the Baal Shem Tov. Shivchei HaBesht. There's a long, long tradition of Hasidic literature, and a really important tradition of Hasidic literature in Yiddish that Yud Lamed Peretz connected to and talked about as the precursor to modern literature, modern Yiddish literature. So Yiddish literature goes back many, many centuries.
There's an expression in Yiddish, die goldene Kette, the golden chain, which refers to how Yiddish literature was passed on from one author to the next. And really, I think of it as one reader and one translator to the next. And that's something that I feel it's such a privilege to participate in that golden chain, to participate in extending that chain. And I think it's going to extend. I think as we've been seeing a real surge in interest in Yiddish literature, and I believe that's going to continue.
So much so that the name of one of the most prestigious Yiddish literary journals was Die Goldene Kette, published in Israel and edited mostly by Avram Tzutz,
which ran until the 90s.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. Yirmiyahu, when you say Haskalah, that's Enlightenment literature?
The Jewish Enlightenment, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of all touched on this, but in addition to the timeline, I was going to ask about the geographic breadth of the Yiddish literature. So a lot of the people you've mentioned have been Central Europe or New York, but can you talk about other outposts?
South America, South Africa, Australia,
Canada.
Canada, absolutely. Mexico.
So
Soviet Union is a huge, huge area. Brazil, and even in the United States, places that you might not expect, like Berkeley, California, where Malka Hafez Dussman wrote poetry. Los Angeles, where Chafer Paver, Gershon Einbinder wrote. There's Yiddish pretty much wherever there have been Jewish communities.
So why do you think there is such a renewed interest in Yiddish literature now?
Well, you're right. Yiddish literature has definitely moved into a whole new era, and there is a renewed interest. Of course, we have to recognize that there are many fewer Yiddish speakers and readers today than there used to be. On the eve of World War II, there were 13 million Yiddish speakers in the world, and today it's estimated that 600,000 people speak Yiddish. Now, that's kind of a lot. The growing ultra-Orthodox community raises its children in Yiddish, and in recent years, there have been a number of really positive developments for Yiddish. 24 college campuses offer courses and programs in Yiddish. The Yiddish Book Center's Translation Fellowship Program, which Yirmiyahu and I participated in, produces a batch of new translators every year. So today you've got dozens of translators working hard on literature by men and women. And I give a lot of credit to the founder of the Yiddish Book Center, Ahron Lansky. In the 1980s, he started this project as a young man of rescuing these mountains of Yiddish books that were being put out on the curb and shoveled into dumpsters by people who couldn't read those books. And the Yiddish Book Center has really turned that around. They rescued the books, and they are rescuing the language itself. And it's an amazingly vibrant and long-lasting institution. And another leader of the Yiddish renewal I want to mention is Irene Klepfish. And in 1994, she wrote the introduction to an anthology called Found Treasures, short stories by women, translated from Yiddish by a collective of women working together. And Irene Klepfish has been dedicated ever since to the project of bringing the voices of women writers in Yiddish up from the deep, translating them, unsilencing these women, making them available to a whole new audience. And since she got the ball rolling, many people have been combing through microfiche and looking at old Yiddish periodicals and looking through card catalogs at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and coming up with tons of new material that has never been translated. And now it's beginning to be translated. You've got a multitude of translators working to bring that work to all of us. So Yiddish is not dead. As one scholar said once, Yiddish has been dying for 1,000 years. May it die for 1,000 more.
Actually, Irene Klepfish, her translation of The Shorn Head by Fradl Stock appeared in The Tribe of Dinah, which came out in 1986. So she's been doing this for a really, really long time. She really is a kind of pioneer. We were organizing a conference to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Jewish Labor Bund, and Irene Klepfish was on a keynote panel, I believe, or keynote conversation. And during those preparations, someone said, without Irene Klepfish, would we have heard of all these Yiddish women writers? So yeah, that was definitely a key moment. There are also Yiddish programs like all around the world now. So there's Tel Aviv, there's Vilnius, there's Warsaw, there's Weimar. I'm sure there are others that I'm missing, which are all part of this kind of Paris, which are all part of this kind of global Yiddish Renaissance, right? It's not just like one country. It really is like an international phenomenon. I think the renewed interest in Yiddish literature has to be situated within the renewed interest in Yiddish, period, right? And I think people are hungry and have been for a way of connecting to their Jewish identity, their Jewish roots, something beyond or next to or instead of, whatever preposition you want to put in there, beyond the synagogue, or maybe Israel, or maybe the Holocaust. They want to know about the culture that was decimated in the Holocaust, or that was lost, through assimilation. So it's been very much kind of on a larger kind of cultural psychic radar for a long time. There's the famous story when Henry Sapoznik, the famous klezmer revivalist, was learning, how to play down south, bluegrass licks. Someone asked him, why don't you play the ethnic music of the Jewish people? And that sort of got the whole sort of klezmer revival going. And, queer people have been a part of that. I'm thinking of the Klezmatics, and I remember Schweigen ist Heut, the Yiddish translation of silence equals death, the ACT UP slogan, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was a really kind of formidable moment for me, when my sort of queer activism and Yiddish activism kind of came together, in a kind of new and sort of breathtaking way. So I think, the klezmer, and that's been going on, for decades. So I think the now has to be contextualized, broadened. I think there have been Yiddish translations and interest in Yiddish translations for decades. 9 one-act plays from the Yiddish by Bessie White, that came out in 1932. Ellen has already mentioned Found Treasures. Paper Roses, translation, sorry, my screen is blurry, by Seymour Levitan of Rachel Korn's poetry, that came out in the 80s. It's a beautiful book, just really, really like physically beautiful also. The Menorah Treasury, and Joseph Lefwich is a key figure. Sorry. Joseph Lefwich was a key figure who brought Yiddish to English language readers. So there's a lot of translations of Yiddish in the Menorah Treasury that appeared in the Menorah magazine. I think this came out, I forget what year it came out, but anyway, it appeared in Menorah Journal for many years. So there's been an interest in Yiddish for a very long time. And I do think, we stand on our forebears. And again, back to the theme of Die Goldene Cage, right? The continuity. But I do think that Yiddish translation now, particularly because of the Yiddish Book Center, as Ellen said, is really like, it's just like a whole new level.
I love that the librarian amongst us came prepared with a stack of books at his side.
I didn't even show you all of them.
And I would also like to throw in a plug for a future Nice Jewish Books episode when I had a guest host, Yirmiyahu Ahron Taub, who interviewed Irina Klepfish, and it is an amazing interview. I'm finishing up the editing, and it will be out either within the next two months or so. So keep an eye out for that. So
Can I just add that I think this, lovely to see all those older books, Yirmiyahu, but the digital revolution has really helped. I mean, we can sit anywhere in the world and take advantage of all those programs, all those classes all around the world. And the Yiddish Book Center has not only collected all those books, but they've made them available. You can, they're just there on your screen. And so much is available now that wasn't a few years ago.
I want to add to that. There are now digital, the dictionaries that weren't there prior to the digital revolution, the online Bachner and Beinfeld, amazing dictionary, which is the product of X number of years of work that really has enabled, there are more dictionaries, which, we can talk about later, presents challenges, but it's also, I think it's transformed the possibilities of translation.
You can translate wherever you are now. You don't have to be at, Harvard Library or something.
And sit at the beach with your laptop.
Exactly.
So did any of you grow up speaking Yiddish? And if it wasn't your mama or tata lotion, how and why did you learn it? Ellen, do you want to start?
Sure. I did not grow up speaking Yiddish. I did grow up listening to stories told by my grandfather, Jacob Levine, who we called Little Grandpa because he was barely 5 feet tall. On the other side of my family, my father's side, it's English, German, and Irish, and that's where the name Cassedy comes from. But I love talking about how I got involved with Yiddish. When my mother died rather young, I decided that I would study Yiddish as a memorial to her. Now, she wasn't fluent in Yiddish, but she used to sort of sprinkle a Yiddish word here and there into her conversation. And I saw studying Yiddish as a way to stay connected to her and to my grandfather and to all those people who came before. And also, as Yirmiyahu said, as a way to find a place for myself in Jewish culture. When my mother was growing up in Brooklyn in the 1930s, she considered her Yiddish-speaking extended family members to be what was known in Yiddish as pitzelas, little crumbs, little nothings, and she didn't want anything to do with them. But I didn't feel that way. I wanted to know all about these people who were not kings and queens. They led everyday lives. They were full of everyday wisdom. And Yiddish was a way for me to get to know where I came from. And so I approached Yiddish in a spirit of real reverence. For me, Yiddish was a holy tongue. And early on, I went to my Yiddish teacher and I told him that I wanted to try my hand at translation, which might seem ridiculous because I had only been studying Yiddish for a matter of months. But in fact, it wasn't really that surprising because when I was growing up, we had an entire shelf of dictionaries in the dining room. And we could not get through a single meal without looking up some matter, very important matter of usage or spelling. And so hotchkeying with words, messing with words, fiddling with words, really early became a real love of mine. And a big part of translation is working with the target language, in this case, English. And I love English. So I feel that that is a lot of what I bring to the translation table.
Mindy, would you like to comment?
I grew up in Montreal and went to Yiddish Volksschule, so I learned Yiddish starting in 2nd grade, I think. I don't think I spoke it much, but I was reading it and understanding other people speaking. And I think I always wanted to do some translating. And then a few years ago decided I had a week without anything to do. And I decided I was going to enter the California Institute for Yiddish Culture and Language. SICL is the name of the organization. I was going to enter their poetry translation contest. So I looked it up and saw that there was going to be a contest. The deadline was like a few weeks later. And I thought, okay, I'm going to find a poet. I'm going to find a poem. I'm going to translate it. I'm going to send it in. So I managed to find a poem I liked. I had never heard of Ulanova before, but I really liked her work, Miriam Ulanova. Translated a poem, was all ready to send it in. And I think luckily discovered that the flyer I was looking at was from the previous year. It saved me a lot of humiliation, I think. So I wasn't able to enter the contest, but I began translating and had months and months to refine the poem that I had worked on. So that turned out to be really nice. And so I've been translating for the last few years.
Yirmiyahu?
So yeah, Yiddish was part of the linguistic cosmos in which I grew up, which was an Orthodox community in Philadelphia. It was in the air, very much in the air. The teachers and the various staff of the yeshiva with which we were affiliated spoke Yiddish. So it's definitely in the mix, along with Hebrew, English, Aramaic, Yeshivish. And so I knew a lot of words, I knew a lot of expressions, there were things floating around in my brain. And then actually my connection to secular Yiddish started when my friend Laura Levitt invited Irena Klefish to speak at Emory in the early 90s when I was then a graduate student. and hearing Irena read her poems, which incorporate Yiddish words, completely blew my mind. And then I was having lunch with Eric Goldstein, who was then an undergraduate and now is a professor of history at Emory, and he suggested that I go to the Uriel Weinreich program in Yiddish language, literature, and culture, which was then co-sponsored by Columbia. And I listened to Eric, and I went to the program, and it just completely blew my mind. I would say my world has never been the same since. I learned about figures I had never heard about. I had never heard of Shalom Aleichem, Mendel Machasvarim, Yud Baritz ever. They were not in the realm of possibility for an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva education at that moment, at that time, or the decades before. And I think I've been like cramming, absorbing, etc. Ever since. I would say more broadly, Yiddish has given me a kind of way of situating myself culturally, just as a Jew, as a, all my identities, as a translator, as a writer. It expands the sense of who I am. It connects me to my forebears in a different way. I realize that, many of the Yiddish writers whose work I admire have similar life trajectories that I did. Of course, very different cultural moments and contexts and countries, but the whole milieu of the yeshiva, the importance of the yeshiva, the importance of religious literature and Hebrew and the persistence of Hebrew, all of those things have enriched the lives of Yiddish writers for decades. Chaim Grada, among one of the most famous among them. So yeah, I would say those are some of the ways that Yiddish has enriched my life and kind of connected me to that larger goldene cage, goldene pave, the golden peacock. Lots of goldenes, yeah. Goldene traditie, the golden tradition of Yiddishkeit, broadly speaking.
Yirmiyahu, you mentioned Yeshivish. This is a language I've never heard of.
There is a dictionary of Yeshivish, actually. I'm forgetting who the compiler is.
Was that
so
Sarah
you've caught me.
Ben-Or?
I know Sarah Ben-Or has written a lot about Jewish English. Has she also written about? I'm sure she's written about Yeshivish. Yeah.
I know
I
she's
don't
done
think
some. I don't know if she wrote a book.
Yeah. There's definitely a dictionary of Yeshivish, and I'm pretty sure Sarah Ben-Or has written about it as a language.
And it is?
It's a language that incorporates Aramaic, Hebrew, Yiddish, English into its own distinctive melange. And there are different nuances of meanings of words, pronunciations. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
So for each of you, would you talk about the projects that you've worked on and what drew you to those particular authors? Ellen, would you like to start?
Sure. As I said, I had been studying Yiddish for a matter of months, and I went to my teacher and I said I wanted to do some translation, and he went to his bookshelf and he pulled off the shelf this little gray volume, and he showed me that it had been inscribed to him by the author, and that was Bluma Lempel, and her book, A Moment in Time, a moment of truth. So I opened this book, and by that time I had met Yirmiyahu Aaron Taub in a reading group, Yiddish reading group, and we started reading this, and we were just amazed by what we found, because here was this writer we had really never heard of, and the stories ranged from, a woman on an abortion table, a woman having an affair with her blind son, a woman who's posing as a Nazi, mistress and actually being a spy, and all kinds of people, really taboo-breaking literature, poetic images, a rich imagination. And we started translating her. And as you can tell from our different life stories, we made quite a team. You know, we brought really different things to the table. And so every Sunday we'd be sitting at the dining room table going through this work by Bluma Lempel. And the result was a collection called Oedipus in Brooklyn and Other Stories. And as I say, that story of the woman who's having a relationship with her son, it will really knock your socks off. I then went on to translate Yenta Mash through the Yiddish Book Center translation program. And this is a very different writer. Yenta Mash was born in Moldova, which is, you know, near Romania and Ukraine. And she was then exiled to Siberia during World War II by the Soviets. And she spent 7 years chopping down trees in the forests of Siberia, then moved back to Moldova, eventually emigrated to Israel. And only then did she start to write, in the latter years of her life. And she became really a master chronicler of exile based on her own life story. And her stories range from stories of girlhood through stories of old age. And I selected 16 of these stories, and you know, they take you from a young woman through an older woman who finds love, finds romance late in life. And I really feel that Yenta Mash, through reading her, I have gained a lot of insight into people's resilience, you know, human resources, how people just manage to get through really unlivable situations. And I have to say, I thought about those stories a lot as the pandemic began, and just thought about how people used humor and connection to each other and just strength to get through hard times. So I think both of these works, really, really different, have really amazed me with just what they bring to us and how much we can learn from them and how universal they are and how unique they are at the same time. So it's been a really rich experience for me to translate both of these women.
Wonderful. Mindy or Yirmiyahu?
Yirmiyahu, do you want to follow that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I would say, for me, translation is an act of love, and it's an act of advocacy. It means that you are going to be spending 3 to 10 years with a voice, with a book. You had better love it. It had better be something that you really, 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 really care about and believe that the world must read, beyond Yiddish readers. And so that's the premise. That's where I start with. For me, it has to be a book that I emotionally connect with. It can't just be a book I necessarily just sort of admire intellectually from a scholarly perspective. I have to really like feel it in my bones, in my skin, in my organs, everywhere in my body. And that's where I start, because it's going to be a struggle. There's so many layers of struggle with translation. There's the heirs, the family. Do I have the rights? Do I, and then there's all the language questions, which are like all other. I know we're going to talk about that later. That's always in play. So you really have to love it. And I think all of the books that I worked on, there's always been, something that has drawn me to them, something in particular. Ellen has talked about Bluma Lempel, who really was, just an extraordinary figure. My next project was Rachmiel Bricks, who wrote really kind of vivid and rich. I translated his memoirs. He also wrote amazing sort of dark fiction about the Holocaust. And also I should say that I'm drawn to writers who I feel more people need to know about them. So I'm not necessarily going to do another translation of Shalom Aleichem, even something that hasn't been translated. I really want to cover writers that haven't been or have been very under-translated, shall we say, under or barely at all. Brix is an amazing chronicler of the Holocaust. I translated Triptych. I'd say the middle book, which is sort of pre the full horrors, is really incredible. The early days of the invasion of Poland are really sort of harrowing, as the news starts to tighten. And then he wrote about his experiences in internment camps in a kind of complicated manner, I would say, in which he presents himself often very unflatteringly, sort of unheroically, which really drew me to that text. Ida Maze, who wrote Dina, is an extraordinary artist, storyteller, poet. She was mostly known for her poetry, particularly for children. Anyway, I could talk for hours about Ida Maze, but Dina's a beautiful book. There's haunting descriptions of nature. It's the story of her childhood and youth. There are several scenes, particularly I would say several death scenes, which rival some of the greatest in all of literature. And I do think she is an amazing writer. And then some of the work I'm doing now, projects now from Alpern, who wrote Blessed Hands, Gebenchte Hand, that's coming out soon, is another stylist that I kind of feel like this really deep emotional bond. She wrote about the sick, the marginalized. There's a story about lynching. There's a story about a man dying, kind of hovering between two worlds. That is just sort of mind-blowing, literally mind-blowing, like sort of like as if you're on this kind of medical marijuana trip. It's really, really amazing. Anyway, I can talk, but those were some thoughts. Over to you, Mindy.
Thank you. I fell into translating Jacob Denison totally by accident. I went to a program in LA put on by Sickle, and it was about Jacob Denison, and the speaker was Scott Hilton Davis. And he just talked about this writer that I'd only vaguely heard of. It ended up, I had been to his burial place just by accident because he's buried next to Peretz and Szymanski in Warsaw, but otherwise I knew nothing about him. And Scott talked about Denison. He'd become interested in him because he was a good friend of Peretz's, and Scott had spent the previous 15 years having people translate Denison work and works about Denison because Scott himself doesn't read Yiddish. So a little light bulb went on in my head when I heard that. And I went up to him after the program and I said, do you have anything you need translated? And he said, well, no, I'm done with this. I'm finished with this project. But there's a story that I'm interested in. If you want to look at it, go ahead. So that turned out to be Follick, which was Follick and His House, which turned out to be 100 pages and not my idea of a story. But I looked at it and it was just charming. Follick and his wife, they're a little bit older. They lived in their home for a long time. It's absolutely falling apart. Their children, it's probably the end of the 19th century. Their children live in America, want them to come and live with them in America. They will send them money, but they will not send them money to fix the house. And poor Follick just can't face leaving his house and the village that he grew up in. And that's the story. And so I started translating that and enjoyed that very much. And from then I ended up doing other writings about Denison, and those were interesting as well, totally different from doing novels, but from them, the language is interesting and you get to read about different people. I ended up reading a lot of descriptions in the newspaper from 1919 about Denison's death and all the people that he knew and all the people who came to the funeral. And it all turned out to be fascinating, the fiction and the nonfiction. So that's how I fell into that.
I really loved reading Follick and His House. I think it's the first story I've read where the house was so much of a character, and he described him and the house growing old together and getting gray and getting creaky together. And it was just sort of a charming, funny, tragic, everything.
It is a
wrapped up
lovely
in it.
story.
So I'll ask one more question and then I'll pause and see if other people have questions. Is there such thing as a Yiddish voice? So if someone picked up a work in translation and did not see on the title page translated from Yiddish, could you tell?
Oh, that's a good one.
It depends in part on the translator, I think. There's a sort of a continuum of how much Yiddishness you keep in the text and how much you moved into the world of English land, and focus on the content itself. So, I mean, one thing I want to say is that Yiddish is what's known as a fusion language. So it's a mixture of words of many different origins. It has a German base, but there's a big big helping of Slavic and Hebrew words stirred into the pot, and it's written in the Hebrew alphabet. So this mix gives Yiddish a special richness and a capacity for irony and lightning fast changes of register. So guess what? English is another example of a fusion language. So English, like Yiddish, also has a great capacity for changing registers with many different choices available to us. From the more like earthy Anglo-Saxon words to the more elevated words of Latin and Romance origin. So in both English and Yiddish, you can lower your posterior onto a chair or plunk your butt down on a bench, or you can mix and match these registers high and low to really great effect. So I think that's something that as a translator, I try to preserve that special Yiddishness, that special voice, and bring it into English.
I would say also,
perspective.
yeah, I would say also Yiddish is a language where all of its writers knew other languages, or if not all, like, I don't know, 99%, had some familiarity with other languages, which isn't as if you're reading a contemporary American novelist, that is probably not the case. It may, there may be some who do know, but with Yiddish, they always have other languages. So, or nearly always. And so that brings, a whole set of challenges. And sometimes bringing the language of the dominant culture into the translation can be interesting, can be useful. It can be a point of entry or a point of frisson, kind of tension, that's kind of interesting for the reader. For example, writers of Yiddish will sometimes bring in the words of the dominant language when referring to non-Jewish things, like when the Russian state kind of intrudes, such as when they conduct an obisque, a search without a warrant, I think, or I don't think they cared about warrants, the czarist state. So there are all sorts of words. And so then the translator has to decide, do you want to replicate or at least, let the English language reader know? There are Yiddish words for things like that. But usually the writer pointedly uses, or not usually, but often uses words from the dominant language in their original Yiddish text. So then the question becomes, do you want to replicate that in Yiddish or not? And that could be a sort of interesting, fun thing to think about. The prevalence of Hebrew and Hebraic texts and religious culture brings a whole sets of challenges. So are you going to say Shabbos? Are you going to say Shabbat? Are you going to say Sabbath? for an English language reader, are bring all kinds of questions into play. And then, whole verses, just concepts that are from the Hebrew or the Aramaic are a huge part of Yiddish. Less so, if the author is like multi-generation secular. But even then, some things kind of persist. So yeah, those were some things that come into play. It really just depends on where the book was written. For American Yiddish, there's a lot of English words. For Yiddish from South America, there's a lot of Spanish words. Yeah.
I always
Great, thanks.
associate
Sorry, go on,
Yiddish
Mindy.
with two things in particular, the religious language that comes in. And I find they come in even in modern Yiddish literature. I was translating something by Daniel Galai, who lives in Israel, and I don't think he's in any way Orthodox. He has a story about a nudist colony, and he'll have his characters say blessings or Baruch Hashem, thank God, just as part of ordinary conversation, because that's the culture that Yiddish writers have grown up with, as you say. And I find even in business letters, you'll find quotations from the Talmud or the Bible, or just references to things that people with a traditional Jewish education knew at the time, and people may still throw that in. And then the other thing that I think Yiddish is so rich in is folk sayings and idioms. They're all so colorful, and there are so many of them in the writings. I think that's distinctive.
Wonderful, thank you all. Okay, I see a couple questions in the chat, one for Ellen especially. Looking at the writings of women in Yiddish, what shared perspectives on the relations between women and men, dynamics in families, interplay between single men and women have you found?
I think the way I look at that question, so one way of putting that is, could you tell if you didn't know if something was written by a man or a woman? Could you? And this pertains to all literatures, and people are always asking this these days, or in the last, period of second wave feminism, people are always looking at things like that. What I've noticed is that, like the contrast between Solzhenitsyn's Gulag and Yenta Mash's stories about being in Siberia. You can read Solzhenitsyn and find out a lot of things about the Gulag, but if you want to know what it feels like to have a best girlfriend in Siberia, or you want to know about how the mothers always cut themselves the smallest slices of bread during these conditions of near starvation, Yenta Mash is who to go to. So I think I have been very thrilled by a level of intimacy and sort of down-to-earthness in her work. Now, let me say that Bluma Lempel, on the other hand, is not at all down to earth. She's like flying up in the cosmos, and you never know where you are. Do you have your feet on the ground, or are you flying up? She's got one story about the moon landing, and she's often like jumping from everyday life up into the world of the imagination and mysticism and Adam and Eve and just a really rich spiritualness. So I don't know if I can generalize about women writers, but those are some of the real treasures that I've found in women writers.
Okay, and there was another question for Yirmiyahu, if you would provide the list of books that you referenced earlier, and maybe we can post it when this episode gets posted.
Sure. Happy to.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions from the audience there? Okay, so a question in the chat. I'm not sure if that's from Constanza or if she's relaying it. It's really interesting to think about Yiddish in a colonial framework and the tension with or affinity to, oops, just got pushed up, affinity to the dominant language and cultures. How do you work with this tension in your translations?
I think the word colonial, I'd have to think more about that. And maybe we can talk offline about that. It's such a specific word. But in terms of dominant language and culture, yeah, I mean, I try to let the author's voice guide me and try to follow that. For example, in a lot of the bricks in the bricks parts, where they're German, in the bricks translations, when there are German soldiers, there's a lot of German. And I think Ellen, even in Blumenlampel, like there was some German in there. I think we kept it, if I'm not mistaken. I felt like it was important to him to convey, sort of Nazi German, and kind of the role that played. And also it was a signifier, right? Because I think at one point he was kind of passing. He's riding either on this tram or this train, and he's kind of passing for a moment. And actually, German knowledge was a signifier of Jewishness, right? Because it's so close to Yiddish. And so it could be really dangerous to show that you knew German. And so those linguistic questions come into play in a lot of I think almost every translation I've done. Ida Maza has quite a lot of Russian terms and Polish terms also. And so there, are you going to keep pan? And they're all also the cases. Polish has all the pan meaning sir. It definitely means something. It's kind of it's very specific. It kind of grounds you. I'm not someone who, I mean, I do think it's important to convey to English readers in as fluid and lyrical and elegant and English as possible. Like I'm a really strong believer in that. But sometimes at key moments, incorporating some words from the dominant language can be really interesting. And so I'm always having to think, and I'm sure, the other translators as well, I'm always having to think, is this one of those moments where I really do want to preserve that moment of the dominant language or another language into the English?
So
Thanks.
a special challenge is if you're translating a work that has a lot of English words in it. So the character, it's written in Yiddish, in the Yiddish language, like someone will say, all right, all right, which is spelled in the Yiddish way. Well, so what do you do with that? If you just put down all right, you won't get that feeling that the person has switched into the dominant language. So a lot of times what I've found is that you have to not just go word by word, not just figure out, spell all right, OLRAYT or something like that. That would be one solution. But generally what I find is that you have to kind of slip that sense of moving from language to language in somehow, not necessarily in those two words, but in the surrounding sentences. So if it doesn't work for that particular thing, maybe it'll work for the next sort of awkwardness of speaking or jumping out of the fluent Yiddish conversation into something more stilted or and that's the fun of it, that takes a lot of work, and it's really a joy to work with words that way.
Wonderful. Okay, last question. Do you have any observations on Yiddish writing since World War II in South America, Australia, or South Africa?
I can say a little bit about a book that I have I'm just finishing up with two co-translators about a man named Levi Shalit, Shalit, who was confined in a ghetto in Lithuania, then was in a DP camp in Germany, and then immigrated to South Africa. And there in Germany, and then in translation in South Africa, his memoir came out, and it's called "And So We Died." And it's a very psychologically acute, very textured view of what it was like to be in a ghetto. It's not exactly what you would, I mean, it's not exactly literature, but it's as close to literature as something like that can be. And it's been a real privilege to work on it.
Okay, and lastly, do all of you want to mention what projects you have coming out soon or that you're working on?
So that by Levi Shalit is coming out from the University of Alabama. And you mentioned the work by Rochelle Vaprinsky that I'm working on with my colleague Anita Norwich. We're not quite sure what the title is. It's either called Clasped Hands or Hand in Hand or Weaving Hands. And we're hoping that will come out in the next couple of years.
Just to go back to the Latin America, there's a really wonderful anthology by Alan Astro called Yiddish South of the Border, which is a book of translations of Yiddish writers south of the border. And one of those writers is Mimi Pinzon. And I've read her book. It's a sort of, it's memoiristic novel, autobiographical fiction-ish. And it's an amazing, amazing, amazing text. It's called, is it A Haif on Fenster? Something like that, a courtyard without windows. And it's being translated now by someone in whose name escapes me, the Yiddish Book Center translation cohort. And she came really young to Argentina. And it's, she just shocked the Yiddish critics at her incredible Yiddish. She translated Yiddish literature into Spanish. There's a lot to be discovered in all of those places. And also just to plug Peretz Hirschbein, the renowned playwright who wrote Grünefelder, traveled the world, I believe with his wife, the poet Esther Shumiacher, and wrote really insightful things. And I've read some of his writings about Australia and then I think South Africa as well. So that's not local, but it's really interesting reportage. But yes, all those places have, there's so much to be discovered. Yiddish is a truly international and global culture. My work coming out, I believe, I mentioned it, is from a Halpern, Gebenchte Hand. And so hopefully that'll be out in the fall. That's the hope. Look for it.
And Mindy?
I am between projects, so I'm just keeping my eyes open for something. Something usually turns up.
Okay, wonderful. Well, this has been an amazing talk and presentation. Thank you so much, Mindy Liberman, Ellen Cassedy, and Yirmiyahu Ahron Taub, for sharing your wisdom, your passion, and this wonderful body of literature. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the whole recording will be available as part of the AJL Presents on the archive at the jewishlibraries.org. And I will be editing the audio as an episode for Nice Jewish Books, which you can find at jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I did have the pleasure of speaking with Jordan Finken and Allison Schachter about their translation from the Jewish provinces by Friedel Stock several months ago. So that's on my page. I did get other Yiddish books to be possible interviews, and that's what actually was the impetus for this talk. So I don't know if I'll do another Yiddish translation in the near future, but very likely in the further future. So thank you again, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.